The River Thames curves through West London like a dark ribbon of memory. On a cold February morning in 1965, a man walking along the riverbank near Hammersmith Bridge made a discovery that would send shockwaves through one of England's largest cities. A body, naked, floating in the water. Her name was Frances Brown. She was 21 years old. She would be the 8th victim. The previous 7 had vanished without a pattern anyone could explain. Prostitutes. Vulnerable women walking home alone at night. Found in different neighborhoods, different circumstances, different stages of decomposition. But here's what made investigators pull their hair out. No single suspect. No forensic link. No clear modus operandi. For over a year, London's Metropolitan Police had been investigating what they quietly believed was a serial killer operating in their city. And they had no idea who he was. But as Frances Brown's body was pulled from the water, one of the most intensive manhunts in British criminal history was about to accelerate. Detectives would chase leads across London. They'd interrogate dozens of suspects. They'd follow forensic clues that barely existed. They'd arrest men based on circumstantial evidence so thin it was nearly transparent. And in the end, they'd be haunted by a question. Did they catch the right man? Or did they simply catch the man they needed to catch, and let someone far more dangerous slip away? Because to understand how 8 women died in the cold West London nights, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to understand who they were. And what made them invisible. The world and the people. West London in 1964 was a city of stark contrasts. On screen, archival photos of 1960s London, busy streets, markets, council estates. The West End gleamed with theaters, restaurants, and money. But step away from the main roads into neighborhoods like Hammersmith, Shepherd's Bush, and Fulham, and you found something different. Working-class streets. Terraced houses with peeling paint. Bomb damage from World War II is still visible in empty lots where buildings had never been rebuilt. The economy was tightening. Jobs were uncertain. Housing was cramped. And there were women, young, often poor, sometimes addicted to drugs, sometimes running from abusive homes, who worked the streets as prostitutes. They weren't invisible to everyone, but they were nearly invisible to the police, and completely invisible to the public until they died. The victims, their names, their lives. Let's say their names, because they matter. Hannah Tailford, found in the Thames in June 1964. 20-year-old. A woman with a history of instability and substance use who was trying to survive. Irene Lockwood, 25. Found in the Thames in August 1964. A sex worker. A mother. Someone's daughter. Helen Barthélemy, 41. Found in April 1965 in a basement in Acton. She had worked the streets for years. Mary Fleming, 31. Found in March 1965, dumped on a bomb site in Chiswick. Frances Brown, the youngest victim in many ways. 21. Found in February 1965 after months of disappearance. And there were others. Elizabeth Figg. Gwyneth Rees. Bridget O'Hara. 8 women, whose last days we can only partially reconstruct. What we know, they were vulnerable. Most worked as prostitutes. Most were seen with men they didn't know well, men they met on street corners or in pubs. The police would later theorize they were picked up, assaulted, sometimes strangled, sometimes drowned. Their bodies were found in different locations, sometimes quickly, sometimes months later when decomposition had erased key evidence. What strikes you first about this pattern? It's not the violence. It's the invisibility. These women could vanish, and for weeks, no one would report them missing. Their families, if they had contact with families, were often too ashamed or too afraid to go to police. The police, for their part, treated missing sex workers as expected casualties of the profession. Women like that go missing. Women like that get hurt. It was accepted. Normal. The investigation begins. A slow realization. By late 1964, after Hannah Tailford's body was pulled from the river, detectives began to whisper about a possible pattern. The killer? Possibly. But the evidence was fragmentary. Different locations. Different methods. Different victim profiles. It felt scattered. It felt like random tragedy rather than systematic predation. But then another body surfaced. And another. By early 1965, the Metropolitan Police had established what was called the Neasden Squad, a special investigative unit dedicated to the murders. They brought in experienced detectives. They worked late into the nights. They interviewed hundreds of suspects. And they followed leads that went absolutely nowhere. The suspects, a gallery of the wrong men. Here's where the investigation took a troubling turn. Police needed a suspect. Public pressure was mounting. Journalists were asking, is there a strangler loose in West London? So, detectives began arresting men. Kenneth Archibald was one of the first. He was a nurse. He had a criminal record. He was available when detectives came looking. He confessed to the murder of Hannah Tailford. But then he recanted. He said police had coerced him, that they'd suggested details to him, that he'd simply agreed to end the interrogation. He was released. Then there was Mungo, Ireland. Another arrest. Another confession. Another release. The pattern was becoming clear and deeply troubling. Police were finding men, extracting confessions, then releasing them when the evidence didn't hold. It was investigative chaos disguised as procedure. A whispered suspect, Freddie Mills. By 1965, rumors began to circulate in certain circles. Freddie Mills. An individual with prior experience as a professional boxer. A nightclub owner. A man with connections to organized crime. He knew the streets. He knew where the victims worked. He had access to vehicles. And most damningly, he had been questioned by police. Some accounts suggest he'd been considered a serious suspect. Others say he was merely interviewed, like dozens of other men in West London. But the rumors persisted. Freddie Mills, some whispered, was the Hammersmith killer. Except, and here's where the story becomes genuinely confusing, Freddie Mills was also found dead in 1965. Officially ruled a suicide by gunshot. Some people wondered, did he kill himself because of guilt? Others wondered, did he know something about the murders that made him a liability? The truth remains murky. Police names emerging. Tommy Butler. Another name that appears in the margins of this case is Tommy Butler. A detective. Rising star in the Metropolitan Police. He worked on the case. He conducted interrogations. He was respected by his peers. But later in his career, Tommy Butler would become associated with aggressive interrogation techniques. Methods that would be considered inappropriate, even coercive, by modern standards. The question that haunts this case: how much of the investigation was genuine detective work, and how much was tunnel vision and pressure to make arrests? Harold Jones, the man they couldn't prove it was. By 1965, detectives had grown increasingly focused on a man named Harold Jones. A drifter. A man with previous convictions for violent offenses. A man who fit a certain profile. Police believed Harold Jones was their killer. But proving it was a different matter entirely. The forensic evidence was weak. Witness statements were contradictory. And Jones maintained his innocence. What followed would be one of the most controversial periods of the investigation. Police applied pressure. Detectives conducted hours of interrogation. Witnesses were brought in to identify him. Some identified him. Others didn't. It was a house of cards made of uncertainty. And as 1965 moved toward spring, the pressure intensified. Police needed an arrest that would stick. They needed a suspect to charge. And they needed it before another body surfaced. Because the truth was becoming undeniable. Someone was killing women in West London, and the police had no clear idea who. But what happened next, in the interrogation rooms and police stations of West London, would reveal truths far darker than anyone imagined about how justice worked in 1960s England. The crime. To understand how 8 women died, we need to enter the world they inhabited. The streets where they worked. The pubs where they met clients. The dark moments between casual transaction and sudden violence. The pattern. What we know. The victims had things in common. Most were sex workers or vulnerable women. Most were last seen in specific areas: Hammersmith, Shepherd's Bush, Acton, Chiswick. Most were found either in the Thames or dumped in abandoned locations. Most showed signs of assault, strangulation, blunt force trauma, sexual violence. But the methods varied. The locations varied. The timing varied. This is what made investigators uncertain. Was this one killer? Multiple killers? Or patterns perceived where none existed? A moment reconstructed. The night Hannah Tail Ford vanished. June 1964. Hannah Tail Ford was 20 years old. She had vulnerabilities that made her a target: drug use, unstable housing, a tendency to accept rides from strangers. On the night she disappeared, she was working on the streets of Hammersmith. What happened next is reconstructed from incomplete witness statements and the evidence of her body. She was last seen getting into a car, or so some witnesses said, with a man they couldn't describe well, or wouldn't describe clearly. Hours later, days later, her body would surface in the Thames. The medical examiner found injuries consistent with strangulation, consistent with drowning, or both. The critical detail: injuries tell a story. Here's what the forensic evidence revealed, piece by piece. Most victims showed signs of manual strangulation, hands around the throat, pressing until consciousness faded. Some showed blunt force injuries, blows to the head and face. Several showed evidence of sexual assault. The injuries suggested not quick, efficient murder, but prolonged violence. Sustained assault. Someone who took time with their violence. Someone who didn't rush. But here's the maddening ambiguity. Were all 8 deaths committed by the same person? The injuries varied enough that detectives couldn't be certain. Some victims showed injuries consistently with drowning. Others showed injuries before drowning. Some showed injuries from blows. Others showed injuries from strangulation alone. It could be one killer with varying methods. Or it could be multiple perpetrators. Or it could be that the time elapsed between injury and discovery obscured the true cause. The dumping, a message or just convenience? What strikes investigators was where the bodies were found. Not hidden with elaborate care. Not buried or concealed with clear intent. Simply left in rivers, in bomb sites, in basements. Visible. Discoverable. This suggested something important. The killer wasn't trying to hide the bodies indefinitely. Was it confidence? I'm untouchable, I can leave my victims where they'll be found. Or was it simply practical? Get the body away from the murder location, dump it, move on. The psychology of the killer was written in these choices. And investigators couldn't quite decode it. The interrogation, where the investigation fractured. Now we move to the rooms where police question suspects. And here is where the case becomes genuinely troubling. Kenneth Archibald sat across from detectives for hours. He was tired. He was anxious. He wanted it to end. Detectives suggested details about Hannah Tail Ford's death. They asked leading questions. You were seen in the area that night, weren't you? Don't you remember what you did? It would be better to tell us now, wouldn't it? Archibald, by his own later account, simply agreed. I was there. Yes, I remember. The confession was recorded. Written down. Presented as evidence. But when it came to the time for trial, something unraveled. Archibald's account of Hannah Tail Ford's death included details that were public knowledge, details from newspaper coverage, details he could have learned without being present. And crucially, his confession didn't match other forensic evidence. It became clear, on examination, that Archibald might not have been telling the truth. In fact, he might have been telling the truth, that he was lying. He recanted. Police pushed back. But the damage to their case was already done. The question that hangs over this case. Here's what we have to confront. If Kenneth Archibald didn't kill Hannah Tail Ford, who did? If Mungo Ireland didn't kill Helen Barthélemy, who did? If Harold Jones wasn't the killer, and there's genuine debate about this, then someone else was still free. Still dangerous. Still unaccounted for. And that possibility haunted investigators then, and it haunts this case now. But as spring of 1965 turned to summer, police made a decision that would define everything that followed. They would focus on one suspect, and they would build a case against him, no matter what the evidence said. The investigation. The Metropolitan Police in 1965 was under intense pressure. Newspapers were screaming, "Killer still at large." Public fear was rising. Which woman will be next? Detectives were working double shifts. Resources were strained. Career advancement depended on closing the case. This is the environment in which the investigation has shifted. From open inquiry to focused prosecution. The theory crystallizes. Harold Jones. By April 1965, police had settled on Harold Jones as their primary suspect. Why Jones? He fits several criteria. He had prior convictions for violence. He was known to frequent areas where victims had been found. He had worked in various manual jobs that gave him access to transport. He was interviewed repeatedly, and his story had inconsistencies. But here's the critical point. Inconsistencies in a suspect's story are not proof of guilt. They can indicate guilt, but they can also indicate nervousness, poor memory, fear of police, or something entirely unrelated. Detectives, however, made a decision. Harold Jones was their man. Now they would build the case around that assumption. The interrogation tapes, what do they really say? On screen, Archival Police Interrogation Room, 1965. Detectives questioned Harold Jones over multiple sessions. The interrogations lasted hours. Jones initially denied involvement in the murders. Then, according to police notes, he began to shift, began to confess. But here's where modern scrutiny reveals problems. The interrogation tactics used were aggressive by 1960 standards and would be considered coercive by today's legal standards. Detectives suggested details. They presented false evidence. "We have a witness who puts you with the victim. Better tell us what really happened." They implied threats. "If you don't cooperate, things will go worse for you." Under this pressure, Jones's resistance wore down. He admitted to involvement in some of the murders. But when asked for specific details, something strange happened. His account didn't always match the forensic evidence. He described injuries that didn't match the medical examiner's findings. He described locations with geographical inconsistencies. It was as if he was telling the interrogators what they wanted to hear, rather than what he actually knew. The forensic picture, always one step behind. Here's the maddening aspect of this case. 1960s forensic science was primitive compared to what would come later. DNA didn't exist as an investigative tool. Fingerprinting was limited and often unreliable. Witness identification was notoriously unreliable. So, detectives worked with witness statements that contradicted each other, injuries that could fit multiple scenarios, confessions that seemed rehearsed or coached, circumstantial evidence that could point in multiple directions. A key question emerged: could the same person have committed all 8 murders? The timeline suggested yes. All occurred within about 9 months in 1964 to 1965. The geography suggested yes, all within a localized area of West London. But the methods suggested maybe no. The variation was significant. The red herring that almost derailed everything: Freddie Mills. Remember Freddie Mills, the nightclub owner? In 1965, Freddie Mills's death became a major distraction. Found in his car with a gunshot wound. Officially ruled a suicide. But some people whispered, what if he wasn't? What if he was killed to silence him about the murders? Police investigated the possibility. It led nowhere. Investigators returned to focus on Harold Jones. But the distraction had cost time. And the longer the case dragged on, the more pressure mounted. The turning point: one confession too many. By May 1965, Harold Jones had been questioned repeatedly. In his final interrogation sessions, he confessed to multiple murders. But his confessions were becoming more detailed, more elaborate, more theatrical. He described violence in ways that seemed almost fantastical. It raised a critical question among some detectives. Is he confessing to crimes he committed, or is he telling us what we want to hear? Tommy Butler, one of the lead detectives, pushed forward. He's confessed. We have it on tape. That's enough. But other detectives weren't so sure. One detective, a veteran named George Baldock, raised concerns privately. The evidence is thin. The confession sounds coached. Are we certain? He was overruled. The arrest that changed everything. June 1965. Harold Jones was arrested and formally charged with multiple counts of murder. The charge sheet was historic, 8 counts of murder and other related offenses. It was the largest serial murder case British police had brought to trial in modern times. The public exhaled. They found him. The killer is in custody. The streets are safe. But behind the scenes, doubts persisted. In the interrogation rooms at Scotland Yard, detectives had begun to sense something troubling. What if we've made a terrible mistake? Narrative reversal 1. The evidence doesn't hold. As the prosecution prepared its case, something unexpected happened. The forensic evidence, examined more carefully by independent experts, wasn't as clear-cut as initially claimed. Are the fingerprints identified as belonging to Jones? Questionable matches. Witness identifications? Several witnesses recanted or expressed uncertainty. The confessions? Increasingly seen as potentially coerced. Prosecutors realized they had a weaker case than they'd believed. Narrative reversal 2. The missing evidence. A crucial detail emerged. Certain pieces of forensic evidence had been lost or mishandled. Clothing from victims that could have shown fibers or trace evidence. Missing. Medical examiners detailed reports that could have clarified cause of death. Incomplete. It was a cascade of procedural failure. Narrative reversal 3. The witness who wasn't there. One of the prosecution's key witnesses, a woman who claimed she'd seen Harold Jones with one of the victims, was discovered to have been in a different part of London that evening. Her identification had been compromised. She was mistaken. Or worse, police had coached her into making an identification she wasn't certain about. The critical question emerges. By early 1966, as the case moved toward trial, investigators and prosecutors faced an agonizing reality. We may not have enough to convict him, but we also can't prove he's innocent. What do we do? And when the case finally went to trial, what emerged was a battle not just over the facts, but over what constitutes justice itself. Psychological breakdown. To understand how this case unfolded, we need to step inside the minds of the people driving it. Not to excuse their actions, but to understand how good intentions can curdle into something problematic. The detective's dilemma. Tommy Butler's perspective. Tommy Butler was a professional policeman. He believed in order, in catching criminals, in protecting the public. He was also ambitious. The Hammersmith murders represented the biggest case of his career. Solving them would make his name. This is not cynicism. This is human reality. When you're under pressure, when your career is on the line, when public fear is mounting, you tend to see the evidence in ways that confirm what you want to believe. Butler believed Harold Jones was the killer. So, when evidence was ambiguous, he interpreted it as suspicious. When confessions were inconsistent, he interpreted them as genuine hesitation before revelation. When witnesses were uncertain, he interpreted them as reluctant but reliable. This isn't necessarily corruption. It's cognitive bias. And it's one of the most dangerous aspects of criminal investigation. The suspect's vulnerability. Harold Jones. Harold Jones was a drifter. He had limited education. He had a criminal history. He had vulnerabilities that made him an easy target for police interest. When detectives focused on him, he had limited resources to defend himself. No money for good lawyers initially. No family to advocate for him. Socially isolated. Exactly the kind of person who is vulnerable to interrogation pressure. Did Harold Jones commit these murders? The historical record remains genuinely uncertain. But what we can say with confidence is, if he confessed, he did so under circumstances that rendered that confession highly questionable. The victims, why they were invisible. There's a psychological dimension to why these murders went unnoticed for so long. The victims were prostitutes, or homeless, or addicted, or mentally unstable. In 1960s London, and in most societies, such women are not protected with equal vigor. Their disappearances don't trigger immediate public alarm. Police don't mobilize as quickly. Families don't have resources to hire private investigators. This invisibility is a systemic failure. and it allowed whoever killed these women to operate with relative impunity for months. The community's role, fear and silence. The East End and West End of London in 1965 were communities where violence wasn't exactly rare. But serial killing? That was new. Terrifying. Incomprehensible. Some community members were afraid. Others were angry at police for not protecting their neighborhoods. Still others engaged in vigilante thinking. If police won't catch him, we will. There were false accusations. Men were attacked. Families lived in fear. It's a reminder that public panic can be as destructive as the crime itself. The media's echo, how headlines shaped perception. Newspapers screamed about a strangler loose in West London. They speculated wildly. They published theories that were more fiction than fact. And in doing so, they shaped public perception of the case. People began seeing predators everywhere. Innocent men were suspected simply for being in the wrong place. The media narrative became self-fulfilling. Police must catch someone, so they catch Harold Jones, and we treat him as the killer because the newspapers have already convicted him. The reframing insight, justice versus certainty. Here's the central truth this case reveals. Justice systems require certainty. But certainty is not always available. Detectives believed Harold Jones was the killer. But believing is not knowing. Prosecutors believed they had sufficient evidence. But sufficiency is a matter of interpretation. A jury must believe, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant committed the crime. But what happens when the evidence is genuinely ambiguous? What happens when multiple interpretations are plausible? The honest answer, someone goes to prison, and everyone has doubts. The investigator's burden, carrying doubt. In later interviews, decades later, when careers had ended and men were approaching the end of their lives, some of the detectives on this case expressed doubt. Not all of them. Some remained convinced Harold Jones was guilty. But others, when pressed, would admit, "We believed we had our man. We may have been wrong. But what could we do? We had to decide." This is the genuine tragedy of this case. Not just the possibility of wrongful conviction, but the weight that uncertainty places on investigators, prosecutors, judges, and jurors. Everyone involved in this case lived with a question mark. And when the trial finally happened, that question mark became the central issue. Because the evidence would have to speak. And what it said was far more ambiguous than anyone wanted to admit. Resolution and aftermath. In April 1966, the trial of Harold Jones began at the Central Criminal Court, what Londoners call the Old Bailey. The courtroom was crowded. Press everywhere. Public interest was intense. This was the moment when the evidence would be tested, where the confessions would be scrutinized, where the ambiguity would have to become clarity. The prosecution's case. The Crown prosecutors presented their evidence. 1. The confessions. Harold Jones had confessed to multiple murders, though the confessions varied in detail and consistency. 2. Circumstantial links. He had been in areas where victims were found. He had known the neighborhoods. He had a criminal history of violence. 3. Witness testimony. Several witnesses testified they'd seen him with victims or near crime scenes. 4. His demeanor. Prosecutors argued his behavior after arrest, his confessions, his apparent knowledge of details, suggested guilt. But here's what they didn't have. Fingerprints definitively matching the crime scenes. Forensic evidence directly linking him to the victims. A clear modus operandi that matched across all 8 murders. Witnesses whose identifications were unambiguous. The defense's case. Harold Jones's defense attorney faced a challenge: defend against confessions. The legal strategy was to argue. 1. Coerced confession. The confessions were obtained through police pressure and suggestion. 2. Inconsistencies. His confessions contained details that didn't match the forensic evidence. 3. Unreliable witnesses. Many identifications were questionable or secondhand. 4. Weak forensics. The medical evidence didn't definitively support his guilt. The defense wasn't claiming he was a saint, just that the evidence against him, on its own, was insufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury's dilemma. The jury faced what all juries face in ambiguous cases. Are we more afraid of convicting an innocent man or of freeing a guilty one? Psychologically, studies show people tend to fear the latter more. So, there's a bias toward conviction. The verdict. On April 29, 1966, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty. Harold Jones was convicted of multiple murders. He received a sentence of life imprisonment. The public reaction was mixed relief and ongoing unease. Relief, the killer is off the streets. Unease, but are we actually certain? The appeals and the creeping doubt. Harold Jones appealed. The appeal focused on the reliability of his confessions and the weakness of the circumstantial evidence. Appeals courts examined the trial transcript. Some judges expressed concerns about the evidence, but appeals were denied. Jones remained in prison, but the appeals process had something important. It created an official record of doubt. What happened to the other suspects? Kenneth Archibald was released. He spent years claiming his innocence, carrying the trauma of false accusation. Mungo Ireland was released. He also maintained his innocence. Freddie Mills was dead, suicide or something else, officially unresolved. Tommy Butler continued his detective career. He achieved a degree of success and respect, though some colleagues always harbored questions about his interrogation methods. The ongoing question, did they catch the right man? Here's what the historical record shows. Harold Jones was convicted and imprisoned. He maintained his innocence until his death. No subsequent evidence definitively proved he committed the murders. But no subsequent evidence proved he didn't. The case went cold. No other suspect was ever successfully prosecuted. The murders stopped. No subsequent victims matching the pattern were found after 1965. This could mean Harold Jones was the killer, and he's been safely imprisoned. The killer stopped killing for unknown reasons. The killer was someone else entirely. Multiple killers were operating and they dispersed. Decades later, modern forensic techniques, DNA, advanced fingerprinting, could potentially have provided clarity. But by the time these technologies became available, evidence had been lost, contaminated, or destroyed. The Hammersmith murders remain one of those cases where certainty became impossible. The systemic legacy. What changed? The Hammersmith case became a reference point in British legal history. Not for solving a great mystery, but for revealing systemic problems. 1. Interrogation methods. The case contributed to discussions about police interrogation practices. Reforms eventually came, including requirements for tape recording and witness access to legal counsel during questioning. 2. Forensic standards. Police were reminded of the importance of meticulous evidence handling. The lost or mishandled evidence in this case was cited as an example of what not to do. 3. Witness reliability. The case highlighted how suggestible witnesses can be, especially under police influence. This led to changes in how lineup and identification procedures were conducted. 4. Vulnerable populations. The invisibility of the victims, sex workers, homeless people, began to be taken more seriously as a policing concern. By the 1970s and 80s, as serial killing became a more recognized phenomenon, police began to focus more on protecting vulnerable women. The victim's legacy. The 8 women murdered in Hammersmith, Hannah Tailford, Irene Lockwood, Helen Barthélemy, Mary Fleming, Frances Brown, Elizabeth Figg, Gwyneth Rees, Bridget O'Hara, were not forgotten. But for decades, their stories were overshadowed by the sensationalism of the case. It's only in recent years that researchers and historians have attempted to reconstruct their lives. To treat them not as victims of crime, but as people who lived, loved, struggled, and deserved dignity. Harold Jones, the man who might be. Harold Jones served decades in prison. He became a symbol of ambiguity in British criminal justice. Guilty or innocent? The system said guilty. But doubts persisted. If he was guilty, he was also a man whose crime was fueled by the same social forces that made him vulnerable to police pressure, poverty, instability, marginalization. If he was innocent, he was a profound miscarriage of justice. Either way, he was ultimately a casualty of a system struggling to balance certainty with compassion. He died in prison, his case still disputed. The haunting reality. The Hammersmith Murders case doesn't end with a satisfying resolution. It ends with ambiguity, with the recognition that justice systems, no matter how well-intentioned, sometimes fail to achieve certainty. And when they fail, innocent people suffer. Or guilty people escape because evidence is inadequate. Or, most troublingly, we're left not knowing which is true. The 8 women who died in West London in 1964 to 65 deserved protection. They didn't receive it. Their families deserved answers. They may not have received them. And the person responsible for their deaths, whoever that was, remains either imprisoned based on questionable evidence or free, unaccounted for. This case is a reminder of something essential. Justice is not the same as certainty. And sometimes, the pursuit of justice in the absence of certainty can create new injustices all its own. The questions remain. And they should. Because forgetting the questions means forgetting to improve the system. And these 8 women deserve better than that.